I was assigned segment blocks in my favorite order here, which is BDE. We were talking on the phone yesterday about who's going to start each block, which is like a little inside baseball thing that Saga and Krystal do, and Ryan and I probably should do. But I got the B block, the D block, and the E block, and I had to make the joke. So,
well, Saga and I are just more like planny, like a little more stressy and planning than you guys are, and you guys are a little more like. You got that like chill, like fish vibe, I guess. He put
did you see he put a fish water bottle on his?
I did not notice that. That was funny.
Obviously. Well, we're going to talk about the border. Actually, it's perfect for section B because there's a really interesting Rolling Stone report, and we can put B1 up on the screen here. That Stephen Miller, who you are surely familiar with as one of Trump's big advisors, particularly on the border, particularly on immigration issues, quote, advocated using U.S. Predator drones in 2018 to blow up migrant boats full of unarmed civilians, according to an upcoming book by a former administration official. Now, I'm going to keep reading from this Rolling Stone report because actually this takes us back. I'm almost nostalgic for the era of the Trump White House leaks, where you really had to be reading tea leaves to know exactly what was happening, because there's disagreement on whether this actually happened. And the book is from Miles Taylor, who is, again, perhaps a familiar name. If you torture yourself by watching MSNBC enough, you definitely know Miles Taylor.
I actually forgot about this whole saga.
He's the one who said, it was capital A Anonymous in the New York Times, who said basically we are, what was it, the 25th Amendment, right, back then, and people in the Trump administration, he was listed as a senior official.
It was like, we are the dissidents within, I'm getting the language wrong, but that was like basically the vibe is like, we're the secret dissidents within the Trump administration.
Right, and Miles Taylor was given cover to write this by the New York Times as a senior administration official, and they gave him the anonymous byline as a senior administration official. He really was nobody. I mean, it was an incredible stretch to say he was a senior administration official. But Rolling Stone continues and says they have reviewed written documentation from during the Trump administration that supports Taylor's claim. Taylor's account, however, is contested both by Stephen Miller, says it didn't happen, and another person present, who is Paul Zukunft, a since retired admiral who was then commandant of the U.S. Coast Guard, reached for comment. He said he has no recollection of that, and he says, quote, I vividly recall having a lengthy conversation with Stephen Miller regarding Southwest border security in 2018. My point was that the U.S. is not exerting enough influence in the form of foreign aid in the tri-border region of Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador. He goes on to basically say that didn't happen, and we had these conversations, but there was a different context. But to that point, let's put this Axios graphic up on the screen. This is B2. GOP presidential field embraces Trump's border wall. You have, they sort of run the gamut of all of these different Republican candidates, and where they've really kind of coalesced and become a block when it comes to immigration policies and the border wall. And then it gets even, we're going to take it even a step further here and put B3 up on the screen. This is Reason. They did something similar to Axios, but actually on a very specific question. Not just about the wall, not just about hardline immigration policies. This one is about the Republican primary consensus for sending the military into Mexico. So Reason says, listed in order of the Real Clear Politics polling average for the past month, here are the top 6 2024 GOP presidential candidates talking in their own words about using the U.S. military in Mexico to fight fentanyl-dealing drug cartels. So the version of 2016's Build the Wall is going to be send in the troops. That's basically how this is emerging, and it's it's become a really hot debate in conservative circles. So on that note, Krystal, it's actually very interesting when you have the Heritage Foundation starting to talk about, for instance, like even the Heritage Foundation, long supported by the defense industry to the tune of millions of dollars, saying we should cut the Pentagon budget. Now talking about in conservative circles, I don't know if anyone from Heritage has said this in particular, but as you have so many people on the right to the point where it's leaked to the Heritage Foundation or trickled into the Heritage Foundation talking about the Pentagon and excessive spending on the Pentagon, forever wars, thinking about starting a military conflict in Mexico.
In Mexico.
Right.
Yes, which I mean, listen, I think it's patently insane. I don't even think it's a smart idea if you're worried about fentanyl, et cetera. I mean, we've been trying the war on drugs for a long time, hasn't worked out, et cetera. But there's that piece of it. There's the merits of the idea. There's, as you're pointing out, Emily, there's the hypocrisy or the distance between some of the rhetoric. I mean, the GOP's, very divided on even using this rhetoric, but some of the rhetoric that you now hear from Republicans about ending forever wars, certainly this is used a lot when it comes to Ukraine and our involvement there. But when you start talking about China or you start talking about troops into Mexico, you hear a very, very different narrative. And specifically, like the idea that has been taken up and mainstreamed, you've got, Tim Scott sounding like this. You've got Nikki Haley sounding like this, not to mention Vivek Ramaswamy, Ron DeSantis, Donald Trump, et cetera, is, hey, let's use the same justification as the war on terror to, justify these, to label these cartels as terrorists and then to justify military action basically with a blank check. So any semblance of, hey, let's curtail, like the war on terror has gotten out of control, it's been a blank check for presidents to do whatever they want around the world. When it comes to this issue, then suddenly there's a very different tone and polar opposite direction. But the other thing that just strikes me about this politically, Emily, is like, it just shows you what a totally dominant force Donald Trump still is in the Republican Party.
Right.
Because Chris Christie, Nikki Haley, and some others, in 2016, they actually were against the border wall. They would make fun of Trump for it and say, like, this is a preposterous idea, it's not gonna work. Chris Christie would mock his voice and, push back on the idea of the border wall. So even someone who's a quote-unquote moderate, like Chris Christie, is now accepted like, yeah, we gotta be in favor of the border wall, I guess, because that's just where the Republican base is now. And I noted too, Trump had floated when he was in office, he floated ending birthright citizenship.
Yeah.
Ron DeSantis has now picked this up. Like, they're just, to me, it reemphasizes what a, 800-pound gorilla Trump is in the room, that the idea that he isn't the leader of the Republican Party is sort of preposterous because even like Chris Christie, whose whole run is about opposing Trump, just basically has fallen in line with him when it comes to policy. And then the other thing that made me think of is like, the worst thing about Trump, one of the worst things about Trump, let me couch that, one of the worst things about Trump in our politics is the way that it just makes everything centered around him. And where you are put on a political spectrum versus like in terms of media perception and public perception is just all about how you feel about Donald Trump. So you can be Brian Kemp in Georgia, who is really hard right. Like, this is no squish, right? Really hard right in terms of his policies, in terms of what he's done in office. But because he bucked Trump on a key issue, he's seen as a quote-unquote moderate. Same thing with, Christie. Ron DeSantis is actually a perfect example. The fact that DeSantis is going up against Trump, he's to the right of Trump on a variety of issues. Yeah. But he's still pitched and viewed in some ways by the public as like, oh, a more sort of mainstream, moderate, acceptable alternative to Trump. It's just made it impossible to actually think clearly about where do people stand on a policy basis, what would they do in office. Everything just becomes about this central question of how do you feel, how in for Trump are you, or how opposed to Trump are you? And I hate that.
Well, and it's why the media pushes that, too. I mean, I think that's what's really frustrating to voters, is that they're forced to see everyone through the media's lens, which is a Trump lens. And it's not just the media's fault for focusing on it, although the media loves it for ratings. They love it, like the legacy corporate media loves it for the sake of ratings. That's why they do always push Trump. Like, going back to those early Morning Joe appearances when two people who now claim to be diametrically, ideologically opposed to him were feting him and salivating over him. Like, that's always been the case. And what's super interesting about this is, to your point about Chris Christie and Nikki Haley, going from mocking Trump on the wall to saying, hey, we can maybe do a wall, or we have to do a wall, is interesting because these are people who have not come around and to the sort of anti-Chamber of Commerce approach that some Republicans, whether or not you agree that this has taken over the Republican Party, and Ryan and I have definitely debated that. I know there's some people on the left that are absolutely skeptical that there's really been motion that the Republican Party has really, become against the Chamber of Commerce because, frankly, you have people like Nikki Haley and Chris Christie who will never do that. It's easy to say we need a border wall. It's a lot more difficult to start talking about things like birthright citizenship, to start talking about things like actually having an asylum policy that makes sense and that it disincentivizes the cartel trafficking that goes up through northern Mexico, and preys on the fact that we have some of these really lax asylum policies that don't make a ton of sense and are easily exploited, et cetera, et cetera. That is super interesting because they would not do that. They can talk about the wall as the symbol, but will they actually execute on a Trump-type immigration policy? No, and Trump himself was
Trump
talking
did not
about,
execute on a Trump immigration
was
policy. I
talking
mean,
about
listen,
DACA.
he did, in my opinion, he did way too much that was terrible and unconscionable with regard to like the actual treatment of human beings. But in terms of the most maximalist of his rhetoric, I mean, he talked about ending birthright citizenship, but he didn't do it, right?
He was talking about making a deal with Pelosi on DACA. I mean, he's really not ideologically committed to this. It's also kind of symbolic for him, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, it's just been so much rhetoric over these past number of years around the border, around immigration in conservative media, and with Trump sort of leading the charge rhetorically that, yeah, even the quote unquote moderates are saying patently insane things about literally invading our southern neighbor, right? So, so it's a sign of a lot of things. It's a sign of how dominant Trump is. It's a sign of how far right they feel okay to move to placate a GOP base when the only issue that anyone pays attention to is like, what are you saying about Donald Trump? Yeah. That really gives you cover to do whatever policy-wise to appease a base that, you know, that really is pretty hard line in terms of immigration and pays a lot of close attention to this. So, you know, it's kind of, it's a pretty fascinating situation. And the same thing, you know, the same brain rot has taken hold, obviously, in the Democratic Party, too. You're talking about Liz Cheney today, where it's like, again, what you actually think on any issue is just completely wiped clean. What you did during the Bush administration, what passed, like war crimes, you know, all of that is just water under the bridge if you're willing to say the right things with regard to Donald J. Trump.
Yeah, and the final thing I would say to just bring it full circle is there's an actually like esoteric sort of academic debate happening on the right now about whether there is just cause for war with Mexican cartels, not with the state of Mexico, because Mexico is a failed state where you have, you know, even though AMLO won't admit it, a swath of the country like actually in the control of cartels. So can you then justify declaring war on the cartels? And that's an actual debate that's happening. And so there will be more conversation. Like, I understand the temptation to drone some of these fentanyl operations in, you know, Sinaloa. Like, I actually understand why someone would want to do that, just take them out in one fell swoop. But the idea that we can just do that and get out is basically exactly what we've seen repeatedly over the last 100 years fail. Because, I mean, we don't even need to get into the reasons, but that is a sincere conversation happening. And that's where I have no idea whether Stephen Miller actually said that, but it's in tension with this idea that on the right, you've seen a real improvement in the conversation about immigration, and maybe it's for tactical reasons, I don't know, but that cartels are actually exploiting migrants. They're telling them, you know, you can do this, and they're trafficking them, kidnapping them, raping them, torturing them, horrible, horrible situation because we have certain policies that they take advantage of. Droning migrant boats is not whatsoever.
It's not in the bounds of any sort of conversation anyone should be having. Liz, I do want to say I'm a little bit skeptical of this report too. Like I'm not, I think Stephen Miller is psycho, and I don't like put it past him, but it is worth emphasizing that the person who is claiming this is writing a book.
Yes.
You know, there's clearly an incentive there.
Has a history of exaggeration.
Potential history of exaggeration. And it seems like, I don't know that much about the other dude in the room who was, you know, from the military, but he didn't seem like he's some like hardline Trump sycophant who would be going out of his way to cover for the former president. So anyway,
who knows?
Take all of that for what it's worth. Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.